Right.
even when we're building out our personal final playbook, it's important to think about our work final playbook.
He had access to all 300 virtual servers in the system.
Oh my gosh.
He did it through mostly Linux servers, so he had what are called SSH keys, which allowed him very quick access to them without having to type in a username and password for every one of them. We did not know the password to the SSH key, so we had no access to any of the servers at a root level.
Welcome to the Digital Legacy Podcast, where we talk about death and dying in the digital age. If you ever asked, how do I protect myself and those I love if something unexpected happened to me? You're in the right place. I'm your host, Nikki Weiss, and together we'll explore how to protect yourself in a world where both your physical and digital legacy leave a lasting impact. Bill, when I started sharing with you my project here, my final playbook, this passion project of mine, you and I we know each other through the Project Management Institute. We're both PMPs, professional project managers. And then some way, we started talking about death and dying. And then we realized we both had a common story, which is we both lost our parents at a young age. And that kind of took us on this wow conversation. Like, who knew we had this professional connection with a personal experience? So can you share a little bit about what you've been going through, not just with your dad, and how that kind of transformed into your experience at work, losing someone?
It's been an eye-opening experience that I never would have fathomed. If you had asked me coming out of college, would I have to deal with my parents being dead by the time I was 24? And then having a coworker who I worked with for 20 years die at the age of 42 unexpectedly, in the middle of a major push to push our company forward. And he technically was a key man in the technical infrastructure of our company. I had prepared for my father because my father was 49 when I was born. And he'd always said, when I die, he'd always talk about it. But you don't talk about that kind of stuff with coworkers who are 11 years younger than you. You just don't usually go in that direction. It's very awkward to have a conversation like that, especially with a coworker you've been working with since he was out of college. He came out before college, I knew him, but it's one of those things where it never even crossed my mind. Whereas with my dad, 100%, I was running plays in my head for several years. Well, if dad dies, this is the steps I'm going to take. This will be what I do, because he talked about it with me. And so there was a real plan with him, and it's one that I understood, and I could help execute that plan for him. With Joe, there was no plan. And to make it worse, he had no backup for us to be able to survive easily if he was not around at the company.
So fascinating, right? So we can look at that personal view of, hey, my dad had a plan. I know he's going to die at some point because he was older when he had me, and you were well prepared. But from a work standpoint, we never really think about our coworkers and how some companies are built upon the knowledge of an individual person, especially, smaller companies.
Yeah.
And we never think about if they left unexpectedly or unplanned. And now, how did Joe pass?
He passed unexpectedly to sleep apnea, which he knew he had a condition. He had a CPAP machine. He was being treated by a doctor. And it was heartbreaking when we found his personal notes, his stream of consciousness kind of notes that he would keep. And we found a comment in there that alluded to, something's not right with my CPAP. I need to talk to my doctor. And we knew, he didn't date these notes, but we knew based on the order of the notes that it was very recent, within the 2 weeks before he passed. And when you find stuff like that, you're like, we could have helped, but did he reach out for help? Did he actually put work aside? Was work so overwhelming for him that he was decimating his own health? And we often, we'll think back and we'll go, gosh, did we really contribute to his demise with the amount of work that he ended up doing for us? And that is a heavy weight to put on anybody, right? But we shouldered that because we were like, okay, we're even if it's not true, we're going to assume that it could be true, and we're not going to let that be a reason going forward ever again for this company. So it's a lesson learned that we did not want to have to learn, but we have to, as a reality, uh, face that as it was a possibility. And whether it's true or not, we won't know, but we have to assume going forward that that was a very strong possibility and that we could never let another person in the company ever experience that again. Not only for the safety of them and their family, because it devastated Joe's family. His mom was devastated. The company was devastated. It literally crippled everybody. I need to speak towards my personal way of dealing with death. I tend to look at a lot of things in life with humor. I don't think everything in life is funny, but I think I need to balance sadness with humor in my life. So even at my dad's funeral, I was cracking jokes. Maybe not at the eulogy, okay, but I was cracking jokes. It's because I need the mood to be lighter than always sad. But I did have personal moments where I was very, very sad of my dad's passing and of Joe's too. With that knowledge of how I deal with death, and my mom died also of cancer when I was, 19. And I had to, be in college 1,500 miles away while she was in the hospital, and then ended up in the hospital permanently, and then died in the hospital, after I got home for spring semester, my freshman year. But it's one of those things where I accept death at this point as just a part of life. I don't shove it in a junk drawer. I don't pull it, I don't try and ignore it. I did when my mom died, and I learned that lesson. I just poured myself into my work at that point, college work, internship work and stuff like that. And everybody was like, "Are you going to process your mom's death?" And I knew I wasn't, but I didn't know how. You know, from that experience, I learned how. I did more soul searching on that and more research, and then realized I needed to grieve better. So when Joe died, the company was shell shocked. Everybody was like, "Oh my God, what are we going to do?"
Personal loss. Because,
Yeah.
I mean, you're dealing with two things, right? You're dealing with the personal loss of
Yep.
a beloved colleague, and at the same time, you're dealing with the devastation of an infrastructure like a
Yeah.
house of cards that was very much dependent on his
Right.
access to systems, passwords,
Oh yeah. 100%.
full
And
factor authentication.
yeah, two-factor authentication to a phone, and all of these things came into play immediately. And everybody was the first thing they asked, everything, was, what are we going to do? That was the first question. I'm like, oh, first thing we're going to do is assess the information. Like I had to start developing a plan because literally nobody had an idea what to do. Now they were asking the right questions in terms of asking everybody, do you have any idea what we should do? Like that was at least a good thing that the company management was doing together. We were working together. I sort of stood back and just sort of let them process because I knew way more than they thought I knew, right? And I knew that. I knew I was friends with Joe for many, many, more than 20 years. He shared many things with me. He'd come to me at personal levels of struggles with technology that he was having with. He was a brilliant genius, guy with this stuff. But even he had struggles with technology, right? So I would be a sounding board at times because of my technical level of knowledge. And he didn't have somebody to compare with too often with himself. I was probably one of the closest people to his intellectual level, although I still don't feel I compared, I was probably 40% of his level. He was just so incredibly smart with technology. So knowing this, I let them process. And then they started generating some ideas. Well, why don't we talk to Joe's friend, Roger, why don't we talk to this person? And we started reaching out to people that knew Joe. And from that, we started gathering a semblance of how he operated because it turned out that he operated in a very siloed fashion with all his relationships. His work relationships were separate, very separate from his friend relationships. He was not married. He was single. He was not in any relationship that I ever knew about. And see, that just goes to show like we didn't know his personal life that well, right? He would always say no to anything on Thursday nights, to do anything Thursday nights for maintenance work or anything like that. Why? Because he had to be at his mom's for dinner, right? She would invite him over for dinner every Thursday night. So we knew some things just because he had to divulge them, but there were other things we didn't know. He had so many friends out there that he would connect with and that he stayed in touch with. They knew pieces of his personal life. They knew pieces of that actually our company life that we didn't know about, our infrastructure that we didn't know about. So we realized very quickly that we had to gather all this information from all these people and sort of draw it all out of them because Joe never wrote a playbook for us if something happened to him.
Right? Because he's 42.
I'm thinking he's going to
He's
die.
not thinking about it, right? So
Right.
even when we're building out our personal final playbook, it's important to think about our work final playbook, right? If and I
100%.
always say when as a project manager, I always when I kick off a project, I'm very diligent with my documentation to say, "Hey, look, I used to say if I get hit by a bus, and people just didn't like that. So now I say if I win the lottery, that seems to be a more positive, but it's still the same plan. It's still the legacy plan. It's like if I'm not here tomorrow for whatever reason, bus or lottery, you guys are not going to be debilitated. But Joe left you guys debilitated for how long? I mean, how long did it take before you could clean it up?
We're still cleaning it up, and that was September of 2022, and today is what?
It's
July
almost 2 years
July of 2024. We're almost 2 years into this. Let me
still
tell you
cleaning it
what.
up.
Let me just give you an idea. The first, from September to January of 2022 of 2023, right? Just those 4 months. Let me give you an idea. He had access to all 300 virtual servers in the system.
Oh my gosh.
He did it through mostly Linux servers, so he had what are called SSH keys, which allowed him very quick access to them without having to type in a username and password for every one of them. We did not know the password to the SSH key, so we had no access to any of the servers at a root level. Fortunately, he left the root password in LastPass for us. He did institute a company level LastPass strategic solution, which he was a big player of. We opened up his LastPass vault and it was chock full of passwords, not all of them, and they weren't well labeled. So we didn't know if one really went for this server or not because of the way the labeling went. He knew it because he did it. We didn't know it from the naming.
I just want to jump in for those people that don't know what LastPass is, right? So LastPass is, right, is just, we're talking about digital assets, right? Digital asset management. LastPass is one of many companies out there that allow you to consolidate all your passwords into one platform. So as Bill is saying, you can go ahead and use one password that'll open up a vault of multiple passwords. So you're saying that you got his
Well,
you had his
we have
his
a
key
company.
password, master pass, but when you got into the vault, it was not
No,
well
it was
organized.
it was easier than that because it's a company business package. Our administrative person already has access, the ability to access any of our company vaults in LastPass. So he immediately just shared Joe's vault with all of the key players, including me. So we immediately had access to Joe's passwords at the company level. What we didn't have access to was his personal LastPass, where he actually had other key things that were related to his friends, that he did, he did cost sharing, services with friends, including me. And all of a sudden, we ran into problems with that because his brother, who was his executor of his estate, didn't have access to any of that because nobody knew the passcode to his phone for the two-factor authentication. So without that, we were dead. He was dead in the water, and we were somewhat crippled as well because Joe didn't use a company phone. He used a personal phone, which I personally, there's all kinds of discussions about, BYOD like that, bring your own device, but that's a topic for another day. The point is, it did cripple us that nobody could access the phone. I didn't care that he was using the personal phone. I cared that nobody had access to it through a death book, through documentation, through something, in case he dies.
42 years old, you think I'm living life, might have some health issues, but you never think about how our life we're building is, like I said, it's that house of cards. How does my behavior or my decision to withhold information impact somebody I've worked with for so
And
many
that was the
years?
thing. Joe was very protective about information. You could tell
Mhm.
he siloed his friendships, right? Well, he siloed the access to the system too. He didn't even want to give me access to it. And he and I had we started with the company together as employees.
20 something years
To talk
ago.
about a trust level, I was probably the most trustworthy person he could lean on, and he didn't even give me access. Did he do that because he didn't trust me, or did he do that because he was lazy
Personality.
and didn't get around to doing it? Probably a little bit of both.
So here you are 2 years later, still cleaning up,
Still cleaning up,
but
but we have access. So we went that first 4 months. We had no access to any of the servers, and they just kept running. But
how did
then
that impact the business?
But the business actually not a blip. Joe built a very resilient system that survived. In fact, out of the 12 web servers that were running, one of them finally filled up its one of its drives in November and came down. We didn't have access to it. We didn't know how to break into it. We didn't have the knowledge of Linux. Nobody on staff was a Linux professional, and we didn't know who to turn to that we could trust with the keys to the kingdom of the entire system. And so just one day I happened to ask my son, who was a Drexel grad, hey, you wouldn't happen to know how to get into a Linux server when you don't know the root password? And he goes, oh, yeah, I took a class on how to do all that. I absolutely can do that. And I said, my general manager, I said, do you mind if we use his skill set? She goes, well, it's not like he's going to break it any worse. It's already down. And I'm like, okay, so in 20 minutes, he had that server back up and running. And that sort of opened our eyes to we need more skills to come in and help us right away. And that's what my MO has been over the next 15 months. Finding vendors that are willing to work with us, that we can develop a trust level with and bring them in, bring more FTEs into our company slowly because we're building a department that never really existed except with one or two guys, Joe and one other person. So we're building not only getting access and knowledge recovery, but we're building the department out properly now. And it's coming together. But boy, it is a long process.
If we were to just take a moment, your experience with your parents, realizing how important a plan is, and then
Yeah.
going through it with Joe, realizing, oh, we really didn't ask those institutional, right? Those
Policy.
company questions to make
Yeah.
sure that
Institutional policy.
everybody, redundancy, legacy planning. So for someone who's listening to this podcast, what, two or three nuggets, lessons learned, can you tell them as far as when working with coworkers and being able to create that legacy plan, those in case of.
Comes down to a lot of the taboo topics of the world, right? Sex, money, and death. And really you just have to have the gall, I'll call it, to have these conversations with at the senior management level in the company and say, look, we are in jeopardy if we continue down this road. This should be a priority for stability of the company. For business continuity is what they usually refer to it as. People talk about redundancy on the technical side. Well, heck, you better have redundancy on the human side too. Because I have a favorite saying, redundancy beats reliability 100% of the time.
That is fabulous advice, especially when we're trying to keep a business, because businesses are going to continue even though personnel
Great.
resources change in and out, technology.
Yeah. My dad had a plan. My dad knew. He accepted it. He talked about it with me. He was frank. His policy was, I need my son and my daughters to understand where what my wishes are. And I need to have a plan for them, if and when I die early or later, doesn't matter. He had a plan for both situations.
How do you translate that into a work experience? How do you
Yeah.
take that mentality that your dad had and bring it into the work environment so that that chaos doesn't happen if someone
Well,
unexpectedly
I
car
mean,
accident, heart attack,
it comes down to documentation is uno number one. Regardless of how much money the business wants to make quickly, as soon as you make all that money, it doesn't mean anything for the next day if you can't keep the system up and running because your key people are no longer there. Whether they've won the lottery, got hit by a bus, or just up and left, and died, or just went on to other companies and refused and it's bad blood and they won't talk to you, right?
just that
Um,
the death of a relationship, we can say,
Yeah,
the death
that's
of
the relationship. It doesn't matter how the separation happens. It's that you need to have a plan that the separation can and will happen at some point. You don't know when, you don't know how, but it will. Everybody has to have a succession plan at every level that's critical for the company to keep moving forward.
So for both of us being professional project managers, PMPs, I would say that this is key when it comes to risk management.
Oh, 100% risk management. 100%.
Risk management.
Yeah. Risk
This is
management.
risk management 101.
Yeah, it is 100%. And if I had time in my life right now to spend more time on risk management, I would. But I know that there's so many, avenues for that topic to just go off on its own podcast alone. We know some people who do that. It's exclusive risk
It
management.
is risk
So
management. So death and dying in the digital age, we need to look at pulling out this risk management exercise for everybody, not just on a personal level, but also from an organizational level as well. And with that, Bill, thank you so much for
well,
sharing both your personal and professional experience working with this, like you said, sensitive topic, this taboo topic that people just need to take a moment and start speaking more about.
yeah,
Appreciate your time.
you're welcome. Thank you, Nikki.
Thank you for listening to the Digital Legacy Podcast, where we talk about death and dying in the digital age. I hope this conversation inspired you to take control and plan for the inevitable to protect yourself and those you leave behind. Don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter at digitallegacypodcast.com. Remember, life is full of surprises. What happens after you die shouldn't be. So keep your passwords safe and your playbook up to date.